Okay, good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Allen. I'm director of the Willson Center for Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia, and it is my absolute pleasure this lunchtime, this dry September far from the sea in Athens, Georgia, to have a conversation with the wonderful Cynthia Barnett about her beautiful, extraordinary, lovely to read latest book, The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of Oceans. Um, we're going to talk today just for 20, 30 minutes. This is meant to be a kind of a lunchtime conversation and escape into this beautiful book and the ideas and cultures and geographies and locations and histories that it's full of, this portal into so many other worlds. So this weaved world of mollusk life that so often we don't pay due attention to. And you're very welcome to be with us. And if you would like to talk with us, you can do so through the Q&A function. And I will do my very best to respond, as will Cynthia, if you have questions as we go along. We'd love to hear them. And also we have, thanks to Cynthia's generosity, some copies of the beautiful The Sound of the Sea to share afterwards. So after today's conversation, if you've really enjoyed what you've heard, if you email me, I'll be happy to send some copies of The Sound of the Sea to the first few people who write to us. But Cynthia, thank you for your generosity in that regard. So Cynthia teaches environmental journalism at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communication Studies, where she lives with her family. Actually, one of the beautiful things about The Sound of the Sea is that texture of the presence of your loved ones through this book. And they're actually not just your family, of course, but others, scholars and scientists and writers that have meant so much to you. It's its own shell collection, I think, as you read through. You've written before about rain, a natural and cultural history, about the unmaking of America's water crisis and the Blue Revolution, and the idea of Mirage, Florida, the vanishing water of the Eastern United States. You published in the New York Times and National Geographic. Many people have had the pleasure of reading your words, and actually the pleasure of reading your book was a great one for me. But I thought I'd start with just telling us a little bit about how you came to this book about shells and the fate of the oceans. In one sense, we're all consumed at the moment, I think, with anxiety, rightly, about climate, about the future for ourselves, for our children, for grandchildren, for people we don't know, generations as yet not here. And the book is so wonderful in its iteration of very deep time and human relationships to the coastline. But I wouldn't myself have thought of seashells as the first way into the conversation. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. And Nicholas, first let me say thank you so much for hosting me for the conversation, and congratulations on publishing your beautiful book of the Irish Sea and its literature and Sea Tangled. It has been difficult for those of us who published during the pandemic, and I hope that word also gets out about your work, and that we can all come together to celebrate these books in person at some point. And thank you to those in the audience who've joined us. To answer your question, as you mentioned, I had written earlier about freshwaters and about rain, and I had been looking for a sea book, an ocean book, as my fourth work. I see it as something of a completion of the hydrological cycle. And I was speaking at a lovely seashell museum in Sanibel Island, Florida, and was out to dinner with the director after the talk. And I heard a statistic that I couldn't stop thinking about. I learned that the museum had surveyed its visitors to find out how much they already knew about seashells. And these visitors are mostly tourists and their children visiting Florida. And the surveys revealed that 90% of the visitors didn't know that a seashell was made by a living animal. Many people thought they were some kind of stones or rocks. And I couldn't stop thinking about that statistic when I was falling asleep that night. I think by the time I fell asleep, I knew that I would write this book. And in terms of not thinking of seashells as ambassadors to be able to reach people on climate change, it's not something I would have thought of without hearing that statistic. But once I heard it, seashells just occurred to me as the perfect, really the perfect way of talking about climate change and our impact to the sea. We've always tried to listen to seashells. It's just this irresistible urge to pick up the shell and hear what it's telling us. And I I came to think that they were a way to connecting with readers and with many different kinds of readers. That's the other thing I like about Seashells. I want to reach this sort of amorphous audience, I think of as the caring middle, people who may not automatically be drawn to environmental books, but they may be people who walk the beaches and love seashells, and that's so many of us. So that's how it came about.
No, it's beautifully done, actually. And I was thinking I was going to get you, I was going to do this in a little bit. I might ask you now. You have everything between, I mean, the most beautiful and concise scientific arts journalism, and we must talk a little bit about the arts and sciences together in your writing, because I think you do that so beautifully well. I mean, do you have a copy of the book there in front of you?
I do. Do you all like to
Well,
see
I
what
mean,
the author's copy
I
looks like? I'm
like
not,
it.
if you
Well,
ask me for something, I'm not sure which of these Post-it notes I would
well,
turn
there's
to.
a paragraph, and I think maybe you'll read it now for people, and then I want to ask you actually about the intimacy of things as well,
Okay.
which is the other end of this, about this as of things being animate. But on page 23, you have a description of the shell's construction. It's a paragraph long. I think it's the first paragraph there that sits by itself on the page. I thought it was remarkable. Would you mind sharing with everyone? Just read it. It's absolutely spectacular.
Sure. Is it the one about the living conch?
Yeah, it describes everything in a paragraph, which is a very
Sure.
hard thing to do.
When you lift a living conch from the shore and turn it over, if you are lucky and catch a glimpse of the soft animal as it pulls back into its shell, the muscular flesh you see contracting is known as the foot. The mantle, the part of the animal that builds the shell you're holding, is just inside, a thin cloak wrapped around the organs. Like the magical cloaks of folklore, you don't see the mantle in most mollusks, but it's there working miracles. As it protects the animal's soft parts, the mantle also pulls minerals from the surrounding seawater and secretes the shell at its edges.
It's beautiful. And you think so much, I do, in these passages of the shell, I always thought it was kind of a carapace as something that keeps you out. And yet so much of the book is about bringing you in, about bringing you into the inner life of the shell. And that beautiful passage you have about your daughter and her kind of early mania for collecting things.
Yes,
And
yes.
then all of those genealogies that you have, I thought was really wonderful, of women scientists and writers like Carol Allison, Anne Lindbergh, Phoebe Cohen.
Mm-hmm,
Talk
mm-hmm.
to me a little bit about that kind of the genealogy of feeling that you attached, how you got inside these things that are designed to keep us out.
Sure. Sure. Well, first I should give agency to the mollusks themselves, the marine mollusks, and say that these shells are built to keep us out and to keep out enemies. The seashells evolved over 500 million years to protect these soft animals from their enemies. And so all the things we love about them, these wonderful spires and spikes, and sometimes this part called the aperture is very, very narrow to keep a predator out. The hard shells themselves may deflect a shark or a sea turtle who comes to crunch down. But in terms of what they become in afterlife, what they become for humans, I did find that extraordinarily inviting. And but historically, often the people who wrote about them were men scientists, and they sort of wrote about them from a particular point of view. And so part of what I tried to do here would be to reach back into history and find some of those untold stories and some of the people for whom shells were important and who taught us a lot about marine mollusks, the ocean, and seashells. So some of those people who have not been written about very much before include, for example, in your part of the world, enslaved people actually found many, many fossilized mollusk shells and showed them to people like Lyell, the geologist who was writing the early theories of geology. He got a lot of intelligence from, you know, people who loved shells, people who found shells, and those included women collectors, wives of scientists, enslaved people in the American Southeast. So I tried to really dig for those voices to, again, you know, help draw a new audience to the story of both the histories and the future of what's happening to the oceans. I don't know if that answered your
I know
question,
it does. Yeah,
Nicholas.
you're making me think. I mean, some of the bits that I find most really affecting in the book, you were talking about the Cahokia mines, and there were places actually were
Yes,
far from the sea, where
yes,
seashells ended up. And maybe you talk a little bit about that sense of transport, because it is a global history, but not just a global history of the oceans. It's actually about the
yes.
connectedness of human perception too.
Yeah, so one thing that I have found so intriguing about seashells is how often they end up being really important inland, really far from the sea, right? So you might remember the the Paleolithic shell trumpets that had been found near Hungary's Lake Balaton, or as you say, the Cahokia Mounds in the United States and what is now St. Louis. In fact, the shell I was just holding is a lightning whelk, and this is a shell really important in our part of the world, in the coastal southeastern United States, that is also found throughout the mounds of Cahokia, which was a major North American, you know, great indigenous city. And so I loved that about the story, and cowries too. I think especially cowries, mostly money cowries, but all kinds of cowries are found, you know, in a slave, you know, hidden in a slave floor in Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, or you know, stashed in mounds, even in American Indian mounds in the Southeast, and found all over the world in these wonderful stashes. And so, yes, seashells make their way into the interior. I was just thinking about ways in which the sea comes inland, and hurricanes are another, right? A hurricane is a way to experience the ocean, even if you're somewhere inland. If all of that energy travels over land to you, you are really experiencing the ocean in a different way.
Yeah, it's so interesting you should say that. We were joking for everyone in the audience before just about our common experience of rain in Florida and
Right.
Ireland. You know, one is much colder and grayer than the other. But I've lived now in the American South on and off for 20 years nearly, and I'm still struck in hurricane season by that kind of ghostly wind that you get whenever the hurricane is not actually going to hit you. It's not near you in any terms that I understand. But the trees start to shake, and there's that odd, almost kind of ghostliness in the air. The light's different, but you know that there's something off on the fringe. It's really continental weather in a way that growing up on a smaller island in the
It
northeast Atlantic,
absolutely is.
weird.
Yes,
And you can imagine, you know, that first appreciating that and then understanding what that means in the sense of apprehension, the kind of like gothic nature of it.
yes, yes.
And then the role I noticed a couple of weeks ago with Ida that came in, and I think of all our friends in Louisiana, but of almost a kind of a roll of puffed cloud that came across the sky. And it makes me think, since you mentioned the Maldives there, and the beautiful passage you have in the book about Buddhism and about the
Hmm.
conch shell and about the mystical apprehension of
Hmm.
life in its broadest sense. And you're right to remind me of the shell's agency. Would you give me a sense, like when you're in those places and you're thinking these things, what's it like to be there? I mean, what is it as a writer? Because I'm struck too about how you write about these things. You've got clarity, but you're not afraid to go very far back in time. And we are, I promise,
Hmm.
going to get to the present and the future shortly.
Hmm.
But what is it when you're in those geographies and landscapes and seascapes that really triggers you to write? I mean, how do you? do you experience it differently than whenever you're, I shouldn't say just there as a tourist, but you know, just tell me a little bit about your set of sense impressions as a writer when you go to these places.
Well, I think the word that is coming to mind when you ask this question is humility. I, first of all, I really struggled with even going to the Maldives. So as a climate change reporter, I think a lot about travel and where I choose to go. I still, I think it's very important to report stories in person, to meet real people, and to understand history in a way that I wouldn't be able to from books. And something I will tell you, something really important about that trip is that I was, learning a lot from books and archives about the Maldivian queens, but only because I was in the Maldives did I come to understand that this story is not told in the National Museum in the Maldives, which I think is very important. It's not in children's storybooks in the Maldives. These are stories that have been censored by the government. And so that is something I wouldn't have been able to tell a story about had I not gone in person. So I guess I would start first with the very conflict of traveling anywhere anymore. And I do travel, and I think it's really important for what I do as a journalist, but I think a lot about it, and made some really difficult decisions about where I should go. And I didn't go some places that I wanted to go. And then the other thing I would say is that I try to approach places with a lot of humility, and the story sort of unravels. I try hard, and I think this is difficult. I try not to parachute in, which is very frustrating to me when journalists parachute into Florida and cover a story like a hurricane. I'm also a fifth generation Floridian, so I know how frustrating it is to read the Florida man tropes and to read certain hurricane coverage and certain kinds of bias in national and international reporters who parachute in. So I try not to be that person, but I think it's very difficult, and I think we always have to be on guard. One way I work to do that is when I am covering a scientific story in another part of the world, I rely on local scientists. I think a lot of times science writers, rely on scientists in their own community or in their own country to inform their research before they go. And in my case, I try to do the opposite. I try to connect with scientists in Maldives or in Africa or wherever it is, to be able to tell the story from local scientists' point of view. And I think that is one of many techniques that I use.
I had to unmute myself briefly because it's all taking off in Athens, Georgia at the moment, and the fire department just went flying out after the land. The person who looks after our house beautifully for us turned up at the same time with a strimmer outside. So with all of that going on in the background, I wanted to make another transition, and it's connected actually to the sense of travel. And one other thing that comes through the book, apart from its real deep history, is its deep concern for the future. And there's a really striking and depressing passage of the book about Western Pennsylvania and a former utopia, which is now going to be the basis for what I think you call in a lovely phrase, the reverse engineering of climate and the creation of plastics in a place that was once deep ocean, is now the Appalachian Mountains. And I wonder, would you tell us a little bit, for just people who haven't read the book yet, about that story? Because I thought your description again about the merger of plastic and shell in the fossil layers of the Anthropocene was just beautifully put and pitched. And piece of the story. So will you tell us?
I know just the passage you're talking about. So to take it back to Western Pennsylvania, I devote a chapter of this book to shell oil. I mean, actually, every chapter is built around a mollusk itself, because it was difficult to organize a book that really is covering all of human history and animals that make up more than 50,000 species around the world. So I chose 12 really iconic seashells from human history through which to tell the story. I tell in the chapter that's named after the Murex, I tell the story of shell oil, which it's a story I did not know, Nicholas, before I set out to report this book. And the story is that shell oil is originally founded by a family in the seashell importing business in Victorian England. And this is a family of a man who loves seashells and imports seashells and is meeting demand for a seashell craze in Victorian times, which is inspired in part by Queen Victoria herself. So to tell the story of shell oil, I take it back to Western Pennsylvania and the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania, and it all sort of comes back around. And the reason I named this chapter after the Murex is because Shell's first oil tanker was called the Murex. And I should tell you too, Nicholas, that since the book came out, I've interviewed a malacologist who was working in the area around the same area where the original oil tanker went through the Suez Canal. That part of the ocean has now become too warm for murex. And they were some of the most common animals back then in that part of the ocean. And it's just incredibly ironic that climate change has now come back in this circle, right? The first tanker to go through is called the Murex, and today a Murex cannot live in these warming waters. So in this chapter, I'm also telling the story of first the discovery of oil in Western Pennsylvania, but now going back there to a huge plastics plant that is now being constructed in Western Pennsylvania. And I get into the story of plastics and mollusks, which is also a pretty devastating story. Scientists, everywhere scientists open mollusks anywhere in the world, they would find microplastics from our yoga pants and other things. But I think you're referring to the last paragraph. Oh, there's actually another bit that I'd like to read from this. Let me do a search for it. There's another paragraph that might be good to read from that chapter.
So you have a great gift for, I shouldn't say summarizing, because actually you're creating a new argument through the synthesis of things, but it's a beautiful way of describing and concluding that you have. It's very impressive.
Oh, I couldn't find what I was looking for, but I'll just tell you that at the end of that chapter, I'm interviewing someone about this reality of there are some plastic. I can't tell you the whole story, but there's some plastic cockle shells. And she is showing me plastic cockle shells, and I actually can't tell the difference between the plastic cockle shells and the real cockle shells lying on the beach. And then I end the chapter by saying, I could, however, imagine the plastic half shells fused with marine strata long in the future, fossil layers of the Anthropocene.
I know, it's beautiful. I'm going to get you to read in another minute or two, because I could talk with you all day, but I'm going to get you to read the concluding chapters of the book if you didn't mind. But before we do that, I'm going to ask everyone, if you do have a question for us, would you please put it in the Q&A, because we're going to wrap up in just a couple of minutes. You're going to hear the beautiful concluding chapters of the book. But before I asked you to read that, Cynthia, we've talked a lot about shells and we talked about humanity. And we've talked about people who it's very hard to imagine. You start with the kind of the Neanderthal discovery of Cartagena
Mhm.
from the sea cave, and this sense of agency and presence again in these peoples of distant millennia, never mind distant centuries. But in your travels to other places, was there a person that stayed with you afterwards? I got a great sense of that, the young graduate students from Harvard you were talking with, and there were other times when I read, I thought, oh, that's a really nice human connection. Who stayed with you? I mean, not just a shelter, who stayed with you?
You know, a person who has really stayed with me is Rumphius, the 17th century naturalist. Does he come up in your work also, Nicholas?
No, but I really loved, tell us about it, because I love this idea. It spoke to me so much of Ireland a little bit later, the sense that he worked for the Dutch East India Company.
He worked for, yes,
He
he's a
despised the work. So
he
the double,
despised the work. And how many people do you know today who are working for a corporation and feeling, uncomfortable and wanting to say more, wanting to do more, wanting to blow the whistle, wanting to shake the
well, I mean,
administration?
even in colonial terms, that great phrase of Joyce's, of Stephen Dedalus, about looking in the cracked looking glass of a servant.
Yes,
The mirror,
yes.
the sense, so he sees himself
Yes.
with a
So Rumphius is a German fellow who joins the East India Company very early on and makes his way to Ambon in the Spice Islands and falls in love with a local woman and builds a family there and lives his life there and is an extraordinary naturalist. And when you think about some of the books you invest in when you're working on your own book,
Mhm.
and some of these are very expensive, the books I am so glad I invested in are Rumphius's Ambonese Curiosity Cabinet and his herbarium. I could sit with those books and just go through them even now for hours and hours and hours. I will always be so happy that I own them. And he's working for this company, and the company is engaging in terrible behavior and enslaving people in the Spice Islands, and Rumphius stays with them for his whole career, but he is doing as much good as he can along the way, and his science is incredible. He really blends art and science in a way that makes you see what could have been if some of the early scientists had taken that, really respectful from both a humanist and the animal species point of view. He was extraordinarily respectful, and he really sort of rebelled against the idea of selling seashells in these collections. He thought that they were gifts. They were gifts to us and should only be given as gifts. So he just had this beautiful philosophy and so much lovely language in his description of the animals and their behavior. So I think he's the person who sticks with me the most, and the person I would recommend reading. If any of you have not read Rumphius, I really recommend him.
Wonderful, we will do that. That's lovely. And actually, I compliment you again from the historical perspective, that sense of the difficulty you appreciate of, you make visible inequity and injustice through the stories, but you also describe how difficult it is to unwind that grip that you call it. And I think
Yes,
that was a great ethical sense. So I compliment you on that. Now,
thank you.
of course, also being an English professor who's used to reading too many books too quickly, I was so pleased that your closing paragraphs of the book were so beautiful and powerful. So I thought maybe to wrap up the conversation, just around, I think it's 3:45, is it? Let me get my notes. On 3:42, in this beautiful, easy to read, gorgeous edition with large print for the soon to be elderly as I am approaching. But where you start, seashells have often been messages.
Yes,
I think
so
it's a really lovely summary of the book.
yeah, sure. So what I want to say about the conclusion, and this too is something I struggled with, Nicholas. I followed the money cowries. So the money cowries were the first global money. Um, they served as money longer than any paper or coin money in history, and they purchased up to a third of the enslaved Africans who were forced to the Americas. So I followed the story of the money cowrie, and as I was just saying earlier, I worked very hard to interview African scientists and African archaeologists and anthropologists about this chapter when I got to West Africa. I followed the cowries all that way and made a decision to go to West Africa because I thought those issues of justice were so important that the book deserved that trip. And I really struggled with writing this, as a white writer, as a person parachuting into West Africa. So I was intimidated by the material, but again, I worked very hard to give voice to the scientists who were working there and to the past. And so I just wanted you to know um, what what I was writing about before this conclusion, and then when I get to the end, I'll tell you one more story. The entire 6 years I worked on this book, I didn't know exactly how it would end, but I knew the word that I wanted to end on. So I'll read it and you can listen for the word that I really wanted the book to end on for all those years. Seashells have often been messages to scientists, to diviners, to worshipers called together by the voice of a shell. They have often been gifts, Marcus Samuel Jr. Sr.'s Victorian shell boxes, the gifts of Brighton that would become one of the largest oil companies in the world. Anne Morrow Lindbergh's gift from the sea that spoke to a generation of women, as the book also warned, perhaps too gently, of our growing excess. Shells were jewelry and art. They were money and weapons. Their makers, the mollusks, symbolize all of nature in being exploited and brought to the brink of what is bearable, the dissolution of their exquisite homes in the acidifying sea. Now, some of them are proving life's persistence as they begin to adapt to those chemical changes. Their best and highest role for Earth and humanity is to keep living their lives in full glory, even more beautiful than in a cowrie bracelet or museum drawer, or beside me on my desk as I write these last words, is the site of Monetaria moneta, alive on the reef. And that again is the tiny money cowrie that I'm writing about. Tiny eyes peer sideways from the bottom of its tentacles. Its siphon hose juts ahead to sniff for algae. Its living cloak spreads over its mounded shell, taking carbon from the sea and turning it into beauty. That life is the seashell's one and only truth. And truth was the word for all those years that I knew I would end the book on. I just wasn't sure how. And only after visiting West Africa did I figure out how to end the book on the word truth. So
No,
thank
beautiful.
you.
And that's so beautiful to read. And we have one question for you before we say goodbye to everyone. And I'm so grateful to you both for being here to discuss the book and for reading it. It was something I won't forget hearing you do that. And it's from Vera Bula, who wanted to say to you, I love this description. The seashells were money before coins, jewelry before gems, art before canvas. Could you please share some of your favorite findings during the writing process of this book? Thank you.
Oh boy, there are so many. I think she is asking for the findings about seashells in those earlier iterations. So I think one beautiful thing is the mollusk shell. And this has another nice connection. I was just telling Nicholas before you all got on that we sent our son. Our son is 19 and he's a freshman. Well, now he's a sophomore at Leiden University. We just sent him off as a freshman to Leiden in the Netherlands without ever seeing where he lived or seeing his dorm. He had no furniture. We weren't allowed to drop him off, but there's a very special shell at Leiden. And I would think about that shell sometimes when I sent him away, and I would feel connected with him. In Java, Indonesia, there was found a mussel shell with a zigzag. And this is what I meant when I said the word canvas. They found a zigzag on a mussel shell in what is today Java, Indonesia, that has allowed scientists to know that Java man, Homo erectus, the early human who we think of as Java man, had art, had the concept of art, and that specific shell is in fact considered some of the earliest known art, and it is in fact one of the earliest known canvases. So I loved the fact of it, and I love, even though it probably should be returned to Indonesia, I love the fact that it is in the place where my son is going to school. So all of that kind of came together for me in that shell.
Well, I think a perfect story to end on those tangled, overlapping histories of empire, of colonization, of human life, but of life that is not human, and a real sense of the earth as being something which has passed through so many deep historical phases before language, before sign, before presence as we would be aware of it, and will be so after, long after perhaps all of us.
Yes,
The idea that
yes.
eye on the end of the tentacle captures that to some degree. So I want to thank you for the beautiful canvas of your book, The Sound of the Sea, and to say that if you are out there in the audience and you would like a copy of that, we do have some copies. So if you email us at the Willson Center, we will do our best to accommodate you. And I know we're all on Zoom land, but I can hear you all clapping. And Cynthia, congratulations on your beautiful book, and thank you so much for all the wonderful things you had to say.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all of those who have joined us. Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.